This is Professor Michael Chapman. I'm one of the most experienced IVF doctors in Australia. I believe that an important part that I can contribute is to educate patients in relation to fertility, infertility, and all that involves. These series of podcasts help to educate you. I hope they are helpful to you. If you wish to know more, however, I'm more than happy to have you contact me via email, which is profmchapman@gmail.com, or make an appointment to see me on 9138 4222. This is Professor Michael Chapman from Life Fertility Clinic, Sydney. Tonight we're going to start off with a conversation about the issue of frozen embryo transfers and where we are in terms of recommending or indications for freezing embryos. So the world's come a long way in the last 15 years in terms of the viability of frozen embryos. Up till about 10 years ago, we used a method called slow freezing, which resulted in a pregnancy rate per embryo transfer, probably only 75% of that of a fresh transfer. So we desperately tried to have fresh transfers for everybody, at least on their first embryo transfer. But the world has changed, and there's a technique now called vitrification, which is a much more rapid method of freezing embryos. And in fact, the frozen embryos have the same chance of success today in a good laboratory as a fresh transfer. So it begs the question, should we be doing all transfers as a frozen cycle? So the pros and cons that a fresh embryo possibly is better, but the environment that it goes into when it's transferred back into the uterus in a fresh cycle is very abnormal. The lining of the womb is much thicker than normal, and the hormone levels are much higher than they would normally be in a natural cycle. But in that trade-off, if you're under 38, you get a pregnancy rate between 35 and 40% for each embryo transferred in a fresh cycle. When we come to the frozen embryo and we're doing a transfer of that pregnancy rate of 35 to 40% is maintained. The issue then as to why would that be so, given that going through a frozen embryo transfer, the embryo's been dried out before it's frozen, and then it's been re-thawed, ready for the transfer. So it's been through a fair bit of potential damage, but it seems that it doesn't happen. But more importantly, it's probably going back to an environment which is more natural, and that maybe that balances off that difficulty that might be associated with the freezing and thawing process. So around Australia, some units are freezing all in up to 70% of cycles. The original indication for freezing all was, well, there were two major ones, and they still remain today. And that's if we're worried about hyperstimulation syndrome. In other words, too many eggs, too high hormone levels can lead to this condition called OHSS. And we know putting an embryo back into that situation can potentially make the OHSS even worse. So in that scenario, we would do a freeze-all and probably use a trigger injection in preparation for egg collection, which we know does not stimulate OHSS. However, it doesn't allow a fresh transfer. So freeze-all is the way forward, and when we suspect OHSS might be about to occur. The other reason these days for freezing embryos is that when we do genetic testing of embryos, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, that we need to biopsy the embryo and then freeze it, because the result will take somewhere between 10 days and 3 weeks to get back from the laboratory, depending where we are. So all of those embryos will get frozen after they've been biopsied. So that's another indication for freeze-all. The other indication, and in clinics that are doing 70% freeze-alls, is that in the cycle where that embryo goes back, we control pretty much when that embryo needs to go back in the frozen cycle. That means we can reduce the scientists' work at the weekend because we can aim to have those transfers occurring on weekdays. Probably also means the doctor doesn't have to come in on a Saturday or Sunday. But again, that programming is also very useful in making sure we get it in the uterus when the progesterone levels are at the appropriate amount and the lining of the womb has developed appropriately, because we can time it very accurately. So frozen embryo transfer is nothing to be scared of. As I say, some clinics do it routinely almost, but there are good reasons for freezing embryos. So when you're going through a cycle and your doctor suggests freezing your embryos, certainly the excess ones will be frozen, but whether you have a fresh transfer or not is something to talk to them about and determine whether it's the right thing for you.
And don't forget that you can access all the previous episodes by going to our website www.theivfjourney.com and select IVF Journey podcast from the navigation menu.